Hi everyone. I want to welcome you to our webinar today, Traction and Action, How to Gain Momentum with Win-Loss Findings. My name is Melissa Short, and I'm a product manager at Primary Intelligence. We're excited to discuss a best practice with you today, how conducting win-loss debriefs will improve your win rate. As a quick note before we begin, please feel free to type questions into the webinar console. We'll have a question and answer portion at the end. I also wanted to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website tomorrow. I'd now like to introduce our speaker, Ken Allred. Ken is the CEO of Primary Intelligence and will be sharing his firsthand experience conducting and using debriefs to drive results.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. Appreciate that. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, as the case may be. Really excited about today's topic. I want to start off with maybe just a quick background. So Primary Intelligence has had the opportunity to work on win-loss analysis programs for hundreds of clients in more than 30 different industries for almost 15 years now. And our experience has shown that in order to improve win rates with your win-loss program, you must have three things that happen consistently. Without these three things, you can enjoy other benefits that win-loss provides, but it will be difficult for you to enjoy what we consider the most important benefit of your win-loss program, which is to increase your win rate. And my passion, quite frankly, is helping companies improve their win rates through win-loss analysis. And there is nothing quite like the experience of sitting with a sales leader a year after implementing and running a win-loss program, and then having that sales leader tell you that the program has been directly responsible for increasing their win rates by 50%, 80%, or even more than 200%. All of those are experiences that I've been able to enjoy. So today we'll be talking about the second point of the 3 points listed here, which are opportunity or deal debriefs. So let's talk about what a debrief isn't first. So a debrief or debrief time is precious and should not be used as a rereading of the buyer's feedback. Debrief participants need to come to the debrief having reviewed the buyer's feedback before the meeting, and then that way they are prepared to discuss that feedback. A debrief also isn't a time to assign blame based on the buyer's feedback or do any finger pointing. Now this is critical. If you allow this to happen, it will not only ruin your opportunity to get the full value of the debrief process, but it'll also potentially sabotage your win-loss program in the short and long term. So finally, it's not a time to challenge, or it's also not a time to challenge the buyer's feedback. Although in our experience, this happens in about 10 to 15% of the debriefs that we do, this isn't a time to challenge that feedback. And so what you need to know in order to handle this situation when it does come up, because it likely will, is remember three things. One, this is the buyer's perceptions. Two, the only thing that matters is the buyer's perceptions. They buy based on those perceptions. And then three, the purpose of the debrief is to try to diagnose why the buyer had those perceptions, not to argue the perceptions and not to assign blame. So this leads us into what a debrief is. A debrief is your primary diagnostic tool for understanding why you win and why you lose. You have the symptoms of the disease in your buyer's feedback. But now you need to diagnose the disease so that you can apply the right medicines. So you've been able to get the buyer's feedback or perceptions, but without the debrief process, there will be many things that you can't really address effectively. For example, buyer's feedback that your price is too high. That might make you think that you need to adjust your pricing, but the debrief process could expose that the real issue is in the way that you're configuring your solution, adding elements into the solution that the buyer doesn't need or want, causing your price to be too high. A debrief is also a time to identify action items. So these tend to be tactical actions like following up with the buyer to provide additional information based on their feedback, or following up with the buyer to address a concern that was raised in the feedback. It can also mean things like following up with people on your side. So maybe following up with legal based on the buyer's feedback and an issue that they uncovered, and make sure that you get some additional training out to the field based on that buyer's feedback. So finally, a debrief is half of your win-loss program's foundation. The buyer's feedback is the other half. So without the debrief process, it will be difficult to improve your win rates. So let's take a look at the debrief process. The process itself, so this is what you actually do during a debrief. First, it all starts with the buyer's feedback. So this is the foundation of the debrief process. The buyer's feedback will have revealed their major decision factors. And these are your advantages when you win, and they're also your disadvantages when you lose. So the primary purpose of the debrief is to ask the deal team what happened to cause the disadvantages that the buyer identified when you lose, and then also ask the deal team what did they specifically do to create the advantages that the buyer identified when you win. Asking what happened for your disadvantages will reveal root causes. Asking what they did for advantages will reveal your best practices. And this process will also naturally expose action items for different team members. So as you're doing this process, one of the things that you'll need to establish is a process to document the root causes and best practices that you uncover. So this can take the form of an Excel document, a directory on your intranet, or some other tool that you use. Primary intelligence clients enjoy a software tool called TruVoice that has been built to address these important processes and provides a secure portal to both the buyer's feedback and the root causes and best practices that are identified through the debrief process. You'll also need to document action items so that you can follow up. So the debrief process itself will uncover action items, and you'll want to establish a process to follow up on those action items so that you can make sure that your win-loss program has the maximum impact it can have. Our TruVoice software platform actually allows you to both record action items for specific buyers and then track them as well to make sure they're followed up on. So let's talk a little bit about when you're setting up a debrief. What are a few of the things that you want to be aware of? First of all, the debrief process is only valuable if you are basing it on the buyer's feedback. If you do debriefs that are based on only the sales rep's feedback, you are introducing a lot of risk because sales reps often do not know all of the major decision reasons or how much impact those reasons had on the buyer's decision. In fact, one of the most common comments I get from sales reps during a debrief process that's based on buyer feedback is a comment, something to the effect of, oh, I guess I knew that was important, I just didn't realize how important it was. So it's important that your debriefs are based on buyer's feedback. At Primary Intelligence, we recommend that you invite the deal team, so that would include the sales reps and any other people that are involved in the deal, the sales rep's direct manager, so a sales manager for that rep or deal team, and a product manager to each debrief. That's a best practice. If you can get those three roles on your debriefs, you've done a very important step in the debrief process. You then expand the participant list to additional stakeholders based on the major decision factors that were uncovered. For example, if your proposal had a major impact on the decision and your sales operations team is responsible for preparing proposals, you would want to invite a representative from that team to the debrief. When you set the meeting up, make sure all participants understand that they need to come to the meeting prepared to discuss the feedback. So they need to review the feedback prior to the meeting. You want to further emphasize with your team, and this is really about establishing a culture of learning versus a culture of blame assessment. That This process is about learning what you can do to improve, not to assign blame. And if you can successfully establish that culture, it will do wonders for your win-loss program, as well as wonders for your win-loss rate. Finally, everyone needs to understand that it's the buyer's perceptions that matter, regardless of reality. And it's very common for buyers to have perceptions that do not match up to your reality. Why is this important? Because buyers buy based on their perceptions, even when they're wrong. And that's an important concept that everyone needs to understand. So don't allow the debrief process to be derailed by arguing over whether the buyer was right or wrong. Keep the focus on why the buyer had that perception that they did. This is my favorite part. So when you do debriefs right, you really position your win-loss program to become a major catalyst for change in your organization. The process that you will follow once you've been doing debriefs for a month or two is to first aggregate why you're winning and losing from your buyer's feedback. Primary intelligence customers actually get a real-time view of this in TruVoice, which you can see on the screen here. So that's the first step, is to aggregate and figure out what are your top 3 or 4 reasons that you're winning, and what are your top 3 or 4 reasons that you're losing. Second, you aggregate the root causes uncovered in the debrief process for why you lose, and then you aggregate the best practices for why you win around each of these reasons. Third, you provide the buyer feedback plus the debrief findings to the appropriate stakeholder to allow them to leverage this information so they can make the right decisions. So if you're working on a why you lose reason, the stakeholder is going to leverage the buyer feedback that's related to that reason and the root causes that you've identified for that reason in the debriefs. And they'll use both of those key pieces of information to figure out how to mitigate that disadvantage for you in future deals. And then, so that's the first step, is to mitigate those disadvantages and then eventually turn them into advantages. So on the flip side, if you're working on a why you win reason, the stakeholder is going to leverage the buyer feedback, just like we did when we lose, but we're going to then also provide the best practices that we've uncovered in the debrief process that have led to that advantage when we win. And then the stakeholder would figure out how they can establish these best practices as common practices for everyone in your organization. So hopefully you can see how powerful and effective this process can be for improving your ability to win more. So a question you may have been asking yourselves as we've been going through this material today is, how expensive is this process when you're involving so many people and you're doing it on every deal? The answer is that an investment is absolutely required to achieve the results we've been talking about. There aren't any shortcuts to this. If you want to increase your win rates, this is the process that will make that happen. First, if we follow this process, I can actually guarantee that we can improve your win rates by a minimum of 10%. Second, another promise I make to our customers is if they will follow this process on every deal we analyze for them, that the debrief process by itself will pay for their annual program every 3 months. So the return on effort and investment for this process is absolutely enormous. And probably the best way to think about this is, how much would an additional 10% increase in revenue for the product that you're doing win-loss for be worth to you? And what we find is that the ROI is typically at least 50 to 100 times that investment of effort and potentially money. And sometimes it's even 100 times, or excuse me, 1,000 times the investment. So let's review your checklist for ensuring that you get the maximum value from your debrief process. So first, make sure that your debriefs are buyer feedback based. So you gather the feedback from your buyer first. Based on that feedback, you're going to identify your debrief participants. Find out who needs to attend. You want to emphasize the fact that you want your participants to come prepared to the debrief. Review the buyer's feedback prior to coming to the meeting. Then you want to make sure that in the debrief you are covering the major advantages and or disadvantages that were identified in the buyer's feedback. You want to diagnose what happened. So what led to those advantages or disadvantages. You also want to assign someone who will be the note taker. So you're going to have someone who leads the debrief process, and then you need someone who will take notes, who will document those root causes and best practices and action items as they're uncovered through the process. You'll want to have a documentation plan in place. How will you document so you can aggregate those root causes, best practices? And then an action item follow-up plan. How will you follow up on the identified actions to be able to have the to allow your program to have the maximum impact it possibly can have. Okay, well, I want to thank everybody so much for their time today. I hope I've been able to share something with you that can truly help you take your win-loss programs to the next level. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions.
Well, Ken, it looks like we do have a few questions here. First, let's ask, how much time should be dedicated to each debrief?
Oh, great question. We typically find that an hour is sufficient. So if you book an hour on people's schedules, you're usually going to be fine. It's a rare situation, I think, where they tend to go over that. If anything, you may end up finishing in 45 minutes. The key, obviously, is if your participants are coming prepared to the meeting so that you can really focus on diagnosis, you're okay. If your participants don't come to the meeting prepared, and this is why we've emphasized this point, what you're going to end up with is spending, a good half of your time just reviewing the feedback, and that's just not a good use of time. People can, use their own time to review that feedback.
Okay, and it looks like we have a follow-up question to this one as well. And who should conduct or lead the debrief process?
Oh, great question. So you definitely want someone who's neutral. You want someone who can ask the questions objectively to get to the responses. As everyone is probably well aware, these can be some fairly emotional situations, especially when you've got deals where people have invested sometimes years of their lives into these things. So you want someone that's neutral. For example, primary intelligence, the program consultant, so the person that actually conducted the interview, is the one who conducts the debrief with your team, and they'll be the one that will ask those questions to get to root cause and best practices. But if you're doing win-loss internally, you'll want to have someone that's neutral to that process.
Okay, and I think your response here fits really well with the following question that we've received, and that how should you deal with embarrassing or maybe inflammatory feedback from the buyer, that's come up in the course of that discussion?
Oh, that's a great question. So you have to make a judgment call in these cases. So there's negative feedback, which you will get from the buyer's feedback. And then there's inflammatory feedback, and it's important that you're able to be able to distinguish between the two. You don't want to eliminate negative feedback, because if you do, you eliminate something that could really help someone change their behavior and change how they view their behavior and what they do. In fact, you'll often hear me say, especially to sales leaders, that the debrief process is the single most important tool they have for changing sales behavior for the better. There isn't a better tool than buyer's feedback, period, that I've seen. And so you'll want to be able to distinguish between those two. Inflammatory feedback you should remove. In fact, that's a best practice that we employ here at Primary Intelligence. So inflammatory comments, tend to be derogatory. They don't really have any value. Where a negative comment might be something like, wow, they were terrible at responding to, my requests. They showed up unprepared. It just seemed like they were disorganized. That's feedback you want to keep in there. That's feedback that people need to hear to be able to improve their performance. But if you've got, feedback where, and it happens sometimes, where the buyer is actually, taking shots at a person and making comments that just really hold no value. No, they aren't going to help somebody improve their performance. Those should be removed. Great question.
Great. Switching gears here a little bit, when's the ideal time to conduct a debrief? Maybe how soon after the interview should somebody aim to have a debrief process in place?
Oh, that's a great question. So you schedule the debrief as soon as you've completed the interviews with the buyers for a particular opportunity. So, here at Primary Intelligence, when let's say we're interviewing a loss, and the first buyer we talk to is able to give us 2/3 of the picture of how the decision was made, but we find out that in order to get that other third, we got to talk to another buyer. And so we'll do that. We'll follow that process and get both of those interviews. And once you know from the buyer's feedback that you have as complete a picture as you believe you're going to be able to get of the key things that drove that decision, that's your cue for time to schedule a debrief. You don't want to wait too long to do this, so you want to be scheduling this, because sometimes, especially when you're coordinating, some of the debriefs we do, we can sometimes have 20 and 30 people in a debrief that all had a role to play in the deal, and so scheduling those can sometimes be a little bit difficult. So you want to get on that right away. But the key to when to start is when you know you've identified the major impact reasons for the decision, because that's what you'll be diagnosing in the debrief.
Great. And we have a final question here, and that is, how do we make sure that we get the stakeholders to allocate time for the debrief? How do we make sure we get those parties involved and engaged?
Oh, okay, great question. So first of all, number one, it's very normal to experience some resistance from certain stakeholders in doing this. Most people are very busy. And they've got a lot of priorities. And where things change is when people realize how much value they're going to get out of this process, how much value they're going to get from the buyer's feedback and from the diagnosis process. That's when that resistance will go away, and it'll suddenly change to, oh yeah, I got to make sure I'm on every single one of these. It's very common, for example, when we're first establishing a program, and we'll tell a client, you need to make sure get product representation onto these debriefs. At least the ones where the product was a primary driver in the decision, which happens quite often, obviously. In cases where the product doesn't drive the decision, maybe it's something that the sales rep did that ultimately caused you to lose, and the buyer actually never got to the product, then obviously you wouldn't invite a product person to that debrief. So, step one is make sure you only invite people that you know are going to get value from the process, and that's based on the buyer's feedback. Step two is recognize that it takes a little bit of time to build some momentum. You may get a little resistance from some people, but once they begin participating in them, that resistance will go away. So it's a process, and you'll build that momentum over time until you'll get to a stage where it'll be part of your culture, that every time you win or lose and you get that feedback from buyers, people are going to be very excited about the process, because it's not so much the debrief process. There's a lot to learn there and a lot of action that comes out of that, but it's what you then do with what you've gathered from the debrief and that buyer's feedback and how you can affect change. In fact, a story that I can share, so we were on a recent debrief call with a client. The audience included sales operations, sales reps, and market research, and the case was a loss interview. We were peeling back the onion on why a long-term client had decided to move to a younger, less mature provider. And one of the key comments generated by the question of why our client solution was not selected was the buyer's feedback was saying something like, I will say that the decision was neck and neck before they got to the contracting phase, and then negotiations with the competitor were far easier than it was with our client. And so this was a common theme that sales reps knew. It wasn't something that was unexpected. And the problem was that they felt like, so sales was frustrated because they knew that this was an issue for them, and that legal contracting process was taking away from their ability to sell. But what could an individual sales rep do? But what they could see from the debrief process is we gathered the root cause, that hey, this caused them to lose. We could then aggregate in the win-loss from buyers' feedback and from the root causes exactly how much this was costing, how much this particular disadvantage that this client has, how much this was costing them. And that's something, when you can bring that information to an executive, that will drive change. And so it's the debrief process itself, but it's also what you do with that information afterwards that will really help drive momentum for you.
That's a great story. Ken, it looks like I spoke a little bit too soon. We do have another question to answer here, and that is, do you have any advice for facing some hesitancy or reluctancy from a sales team to accept a buyer's perception?
Yeah. So it's definitely something you're going to face. In fact, I would estimate that we probably see it at least 10 to 15% of the time, where you're going to get a sales rep who, for whatever reason, and it's an emotionally charged situation, so you've got to understand it from the salesperson's perspective. They've invested a lot of time and effort in a lot of cases, and so when they hear feedback that goes contrary to what they thought, or perhaps even what they thought they heard, sometimes that's difficult. And so the key thing is to always remain calm, and never, acknowledge the sales rep's frustration with it, but then you try to bring it back to, this is the buyer's feedback. It is what it is. This is their perception, and this is the perception that they base their decision on. And right or wrong, that's what we've got to acknowledge. And now let's figure out, were there things that we did that led to that perception? And if you can get past the initial emotional charge of, how dare they say this, or I can't believe they said that, because sometimes it'll be, stuff where, the salesperson might have thought they did a wonderful presentation, and then the buyer says, nah, presentation didn't hit our needs at all. And so you can get a sales rep that will suddenly be, defensive, and what, I put so much effort into that, and now this feedback. But if you can get past that initial emotional charge, level set that, hey, your presentation was probably great, but let's figure out why it didn't meet that buyer's needs. And so it's bring it back to the buyer's feedback, and never find yourself in a position where you're defending the buyer's feedback. And so what I mean by that, don't try to push the agenda that, hey, the buyer's right or the buyer's wrong. It's simply the buyer's perception. And at the end of the day, the key point is buyers buy based on their perceptions.
That's a great answer to that question. That looks like it covers all the questions that we've had have come up. So unless there's anything else, I think that will conclude the webinar for today.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time.